I sat at an exclusive five-star restaurant in Manhattan, gracefully pouring warm green tea for my husband and his beautiful new client. I kept a polite, unassuming smile plastered on my face as they laughed together over an inside joke. They thought they were entirely safe. They assumed the quiet, supportive wife sitting across the mahogany table only spoke English. So they confidently used Japanese to discuss how pathetic my outfit looked, how long they had been sleeping together, and exactly when they planned to drain my bank accounts before fleeing the country. They had no idea I understood every single syllable they spoke. My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old, and until that dinner, I genuinely believed I had built a safe, predictable life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by someone who thought they could get away with betrayal. For the past 4 years, my marriage to Richard looked like a textbook example of modern American success. Richard was 34, a rising chief financial officer at a major tech firm. He was charismatic, ambitious, and relentlessly driven to reach the top of the corporate ladder. I played the role of his grounded domestic counterpart. I told him I was a freelance risk consultant handling basic compliance reports from our home office. It was a very comfortable lie. I never told Richard about the 6 years I spent living in Tokyo, working as a highly classified corporate intelligence auditor. I never mentioned the grueling nights decrypting offshore financial accounts, tracking embezzled funds, or conducting hostile corporate interrogations in fluent native-level Japanese. I left that high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled world behind because I desperately wanted peace. I wanted a loyal husband, a quiet home in the suburbs, and a life entirely free from deception and corporate warfare. Richard loved my quiet, agreeable demeanor. He loved that I worked from home, managed our household finances flawlessly, and always ensured his designer suits were perfectly pressed for his board meetings. He mistook my desire for a peaceful domestic life as a complete lack of ambition. He frequently called me his simple, dependable wife to his colleagues. I let him believe it because I loved him deeply, assuming his arrogance was just a natural byproduct of his stressful executive career. The illusion of our perfect marriage shattered into a million pieces on a rainy Tuesday evening. Richard had insisted I join him for a critical business dinner at a private invitation-only sushi restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. He wanted to project the pristine image of a stable, grounded family man to impress a new regional director from Takahashi Industries. I wore a modest navy dress, styled my hair in a simple twist, and arrived early to ensure the reservation was flawless. Richard arrived 20 minutes late, guiding a stunning woman into our private dining room. She was Yumi, a 30-year-old executive wrapped in a tailored designer suit that screamed generational wealth and corporate authority. Richard introduced us with his signature charming smile. He presented me as his lovely homemaker wife who occasionally dabbled in freelance work to pass the time. Yumi offered a polite bow and a perfectly practiced English greeting. Her handshake was firm, but her dark eyes scanned me with immediate, unmistakable disdain. She looked at my simple department store dress, then glanced down at her own diamond-studded watch and gave a tight, patronizing smile. The first half of this dinner was agonizingly normal. Richard and Yumi discussed supply chain logistics and market expansion entirely in English. I played my part flawlessly, nodding at the appropriate moments, asking polite questions, and ensuring their sake glasses were never empty. Then the expensive appetizers arrived, and Yumi casually switched the conversation to Japanese. She looked directly at Richard, her tone light and conversational, as if she were complimenting the presentation of the yellowtail sashimi. "Your stupid wife looks absolutely pathetic," Yumi said in crisp, flawless Japanese. "I cannot believe you have to wake up next to someone so painfully average and boring." My heart stopped beating in my chest. My hands resting quietly under the table instantly turned to ice. I waited for Richard to look confused, to ask her what she meant, or to demand an English translation from the waitstaff. Instead, my husband chuckled softly. He reached for a piece of sushi, locked eyes with Yumi, and replied in equally fluent Japanese. "You have no idea how exhausting it is to pretend," Richard said in Japanese, his voice dripping with contempt. "But she is incredibly useful for appearances. The board of directors loves a boring, stable wife. It makes me look trustworthy." I kept my facial expression completely blank. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, forcing my breathing to remain steady and rhythmic. Panic and shock threatened to overwhelm me, but my old corporate intelligence training immediately kicked in. I locked my emotions in a mental vault and observed them like targets. Yumi leaned closer to Richard, her knee intentionally brushing against his under the table. "When can we finally drop this ridiculous charade?" she asked in Japanese, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper. "I am tired of hiding in hotel rooms. When do we empty her accounts and secure the transfer to Tokyo?" Richard smiled his charming, confident smile, the same smile he gave me every morning before leaving for work. "2 months," he replied in Japanese. "The offshore accounts will be ready by then. I will drain the joint savings, transfer the home equity, and we will be on a first-class flight to Narita before she even realizes she is ruined. Just keep playing the nice client until the paperwork clears." A roaring fire of pure, unadulterated rage ignited in my chest. The man I had loved, the man I had cooked for and supported unconditionally for 4 years, was calmly plotting my absolute financial and emotional destruction between bites of expensive seafood. They thought I was a naive, monolingual housewife who would blindly sign whatever documents they put in front of me. They had no idea they were sitting across the table from a former corporate intelligence operative who specialized in dismantling fraudulent empires and crushing financial criminals. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink in his face or flip the table. I simply picked up the porcelain teapot and gracefully refilled Yumi's cup, offering her my warmest, most oblivious smile. In that exact moment, the loving, submissive wife Naomi died. I looked at my treacherous husband and his arrogant mistress, making a silent, unbreakable vow. I would not just leave them. I would tear their lives and careers apart piece by piece, and I would make sure they never saw the executioner coming. I watched Richard wipe his mouth with a linen napkin, blissfully unaware that he had just triggered his own downfall. The game had officially begun, and I was going to rewrite all the rules. The black luxury car idled outside the restaurant, waiting to swallow us into its plush leather interior for the ride home. The rain had started to fall over Manhattan, blurring the neon streetlights into streaks of color against the tinted windows. Richard placed his hand over mine as the driver navigated through the heavy evening traffic. His touch, which only hours ago felt like a comforting anchor, now sent a wave of absolute revulsion crawling up my spine. I forced my muscles to relax, breathing evenly through my nose, willing my heart rate to remain steady. Richard pulled his phone from his tailored suit pocket, his thumb moving rapidly across the screen. A faint, arrogant smile played on his lips. I did not need to see the display to know he was messaging Yumi. He was probably finalizing the timeline of my financial ruin while sitting mere inches away from me. He slipped the device back into his pocket and squeezed my fingers, entirely convinced that he was the smartest man in the world and that I was completely blind to his treachery. We arrived at our sprawling suburban home an hour later. The house was quiet, a perfect portrait of domestic success, with its manicured lawn and pristine driveway. I unlocked the front door and walked directly into the kitchen, turning on the pendant lights over the marble island. I needed to test the waters. I needed to see exactly how arrogant he had become before I initiated my counteroffensive. Richard loosened his silk tie, walking to the crystal decanter on the counter to pour himself a glass of bourbon. I took a deep breath, perfectly slipping into the character of the worried, naive homemaker. I told him I had logged into our joint banking portal earlier that afternoon to schedule the property tax payment. I kept my voice soft, laced with just the right amount of manufactured confusion. I asked him where $80,000 had gone. Richard stopped pouring. The warm, charming husband act vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a cold, irritated stare. He took a sip of his bourbon and set the glass down heavily on the marble counter. He looked at me, not as a partner, but as an annoying obstacle standing in the way of his grand design. He crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw tightening. I watched the absolute contempt rise in his eyes. He hated that the simple wife was daring to ask questions about money he had already promised to his mistress. He took a step closer to me, using his height to intimidate me, a tactic I had previously mistaken for masculine protectiveness. "I am a human being, You are a human being. I shouldn't have to explain how the world works to you. Figure it out and step aside. Richard snapped, his voice sharp and utterly merciless. He did not yell. He did not need to. The quiet, venomous delivery was designed to make me feel small, stupid, and entirely dependent on his financial genius. He casually adjusted his cuffs, his brief flash of anger smoothing over into practiced gaslighting. He told me it was a highly classified surprise investment. He claimed it was a restricted corporate bond that would double our retirement savings and that asking questions would only jeopardize the return. He patted my cheek with a patronizing smirk, told me to trust him, and walked upstairs to the master bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a luxury I could no longer afford. I waited in the dark kitchen for 45 minutes, listening to the muffled sounds of the shower running, followed by the heavy silence that signaled Richard had gone to sleep. He was a notoriously heavy sleeper, especially after a generous pour of bourbon. Once the house was dead quiet, I moved silently up the stairs. I bypassed the master bedroom and went straight into my walk-in closet. Hidden beneath a false floorboard under my winter boots was a locked fireproof steel box. I had not opened it in 4 years. I engaged the biometric lock with my thumb, and the lid popped open with a quiet hiss. Inside lay the tools of my former trade: a high-grade forensic data extraction cable, a military-grade encrypted hard drive, and a customized signal cloner I used during my corporate intelligence days in Tokyo. I gathered the equipment and moved like a shadow into our bedroom. Richard was snoring softly, his face buried in the pillows. His phone sat on the nightstand, securely locked with dual-factor authentication and a biometric scanner. I plugged the extraction cable into my encrypted drive and carefully lifted the phone from the charging pad. I needed his fingerprint to bypass the initial security protocol. Moving with agonizing precision, I gently pressed the phone's scanner against the thumb of his heavy, motionless hand. The screen unlocked instantly. I immediately retreated down the hall to his home office, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I connected his phone to my extraction drive and initiated a rapid cloning sequence. My software bypassed his secondary authentications by creating a localized ghost network, tricking his security applications into thinking they were communicating with a trusted server. The progress bar crawled across my screen, downloading every text message, every hidden application, every encrypted email, and every single banking credential he possessed. I watched the data unspool before my eyes. The sheer volume of hidden files was staggering. He had restricted applications disguised as standard calculator apps, private encrypted messaging channels, and secure document vaults. I isolated the financial ledgers and began decrypting the file headers. My heart pounded a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs as the extraction reached 99%. I disconnected the phone, leaving no digital footprint of the breach, and began sifting through the raw data. I opened the first encrypted messaging folder, expecting to find graphic text exchanges with Yumi. I did find those, but they were entirely irrelevant compared to the documents buried in a secondary hidden drive. I opened a file labeled Project Horizon, and my breath caught in my throat. I stared at the glowing screen, the true magnitude of Richard's betrayal unfolding in front of me, in stark, undeniable black and white. It was not just an affair. It was not just a stolen $80,000. It was a massive, highly coordinated offshore money laundering operation, and my name was printed boldly on the executive signature line of every single fraudulent shell company. I scrolled through the digital ledgers, my eyes scanning rows of fabricated invoices and phantom vendor accounts. Richard had spent the last 2 years systematically bleeding Takahashi Industries dry. He and Yumi had created a labyrinth of fictitious consulting firms, billing the Japanese conglomerate for structural assessments and risk management services that never existed. The scope of their greed was breathtaking. The stolen $80,000 from our joint account was merely seed money, the initial liquid capital required to open the offshore accounts without triggering internal audits at his own firm. The total sum they were preparing to siphon out of Takahashi Industries was not just a few million. It was a staggering $80 million. I opened a subfolder titled Executive Authorization. My stomach twisted into a tight, agonizing knot as the documents loaded on the screen. There were high-resolution scanned copies of incorporation papers for shell companies based in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and the British Virgin Islands. On every single page, my Social Security number was listed as the primary beneficiary and sole managing director. My date of birth, my maiden name, my mother's maiden name were all weaponized to construct a flawless corporate identity for these fraudulent entities. And right at the bottom of the wire transfer authorizations was my signature. It was a spectacular forgery. Richard had studied the way I signed our mortgage papers, replicating the exact loop of my cursive letters and the slight slant of my last name. I had not just planned to abandon me for another woman. He had meticulously designed a trap that would trigger the exact moment he and Yumi boarded their flight to Tokyo. Once the senior executives at Takahashi Industries discovered the missing $80 million, they would immediately launch an international manhunt. The FBI and international financial authorities would trace the IP addresses and wire transfers straight back to the Cayman accounts. Those accounts would lead the federal agents directly to my front door. Richard was setting me up to be the designated fall guy. While he and his mistress enjoyed early retirement in Japan with freshly minted identities, I would be facing trial for wire fraud, identity theft, corporate espionage, and international money laundering under the RICO Act. I would be looking at 4 decades in a federal penitentiary. I pulled up the internal communications between Richard and Yumi. They used a heavily encrypted messaging application, ingeniously disguised as a fitness tracker on his home screen. I read through months of their cold, calculated exchanges. Yumi provided the internal approval codes from the Takahashi Industries Finance Department, authorizing the fake invoices from the inside. Richard executed the payments from New York, routing the money through layers of cryptocurrency exchanges before depositing the clean funds into the shell companies bearing my name. They laughed about my ignorance constantly. Yumi called me the perfect idiot in her messages. Richard agreed, bragging about how easily he had manipulated me into providing my passport details last year under the guise of booking a surprise anniversary trip to Paris. There never was an anniversary trip. He just needed the high-quality passport scan for the offshore bank compliance officer. My hands gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. A cold, absolute clarity washed over my mind, freezing out any remaining traces of heartbreak. The shock was completely gone, replaced by a dangerous surgical focus that I had not utilized in years. Richard thought he was an untouchable financial genius. He thought his corporate maneuvering was bulletproof because he was dealing with a woman who spent her days baking artisan bread and tending to the backyard garden. He had forgotten, or perhaps he never truly understood, that my brain was trained by the most ruthless corporate intelligence agency in Tokyo. I knew exactly how to dismantle illicit financial networks. I knew how to track dark money across international borders. Most importantly, I knew how to destroy a person's life without leaving a single digital fingerprint. I copied the entire dataset onto a secondary military-grade encrypted microdrive. I organized the ledgers, the forged signatures, the offshore account routing numbers, and the damning chat logs into a secure forensic vault on my isolated local server. I needed multiple backups stored in locations he could never access. If Richard suspected even a fraction of what I knew, he would accelerate his timeline and flee immediately, leaving me holding the bag for $80 million in stolen corporate funds before I could mount a defense. I had to keep him incredibly comfortable. I had to let him believe his grand illusion was functioning perfectly. He needed to feel utterly superior to me. Every single piece of evidence was now securely locked away in my possession forever. The digital clock on the wall read 3 in the morning. I carefully disconnected his phone from my extraction cable. I wiped the physical screen with a microfiber cloth to ensure no stray fingerprints or smudges looked out of place. I crept back down the hallway, the hardwood floor completely silent beneath my bare feet. Richard was still snoring in the exact same position, his arm thrown lazily over the empty side of the bed. I placed the phone back on the wireless charging pad, aligning it to the precise millimeter where I had found it. I retreated to my walk-in closet, locked my equipment back inside the fireproof steel box, and engaged the biometric seal, burying it deep beneath my winter clothes. I lay down on the far edge of the mattress, pulling the heavy duvet over my chest. I stared up at the dark ceiling, listening to the steady breathing of the man who planned to send me to a federal prison for the rest of my natural life. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I spent the remaining hours mapping out a comprehensive, merciless strategy to dismantle his entire existence. Tomorrow morning the sun would rise, and I would put on my apron, brew his expensive coffee, and play the role of the oblivious, obedient wife. But the countdown had officially started. He had 2 months to execute his exit strategy. I only needed a few weeks to ensure he never saw the outside of a prison cell again. Morning arrived with the harsh, blinding light of a rising sun bleeding through the sheer bedroom curtains. I rose from the mattress feeling no fatigue, fueled entirely by a cold synthetic energy. The transition from nocturnal corporate spy back to the loving, oblivious housewife required absolute precision. I tied my floral apron around my waist, walked downstairs into our pristine custom kitchen, and began the morning routine as if my entire reality had not been obliterated just a few hours prior. I ground the imported dark roast coffee beans, the loud whir of the machine, masking the dark, calculated silence in my head. I cracked eggs into a heated ceramic skillet, listening to the sizzle of butter. Richard descended the staircase exactly 45 minutes later. He looked immaculate in his tailored charcoal suit, his tie knotted with sharp, aggressive perfection. He walked into the kitchen, radiating his usual arrogant confidence, carrying his leather briefcase in one hand and a thick stack of legal-sized papers in the other. He leaned over the marble island, kissed my cheek, and dropped the heavy manila folder right next to my cutting board. He casually tapped his manicured finger against the top page, his voice dripping with faux affection. He told me his accounting team needed to finalize some routine tax disclosures before the end of the fiscal quarter. He claimed the documents simply updated our joint filing status and required my signature on the back pages so his firm could process the returns without hitting any bureaucratic red tape. He pulled a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket, uncapped it, and slid it across the cool marble counter toward my hand. I smiled warmly, wiping my hands on my apron to play the part of the compliant, unquestioning spouse. I picked up the heavy silver pen and pulled the stack of documents closer. Richard turned his back to me, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the French press. That was his first mistake. He assumed a housewife would just flip to the yellow sticky notes and sign blindly. He forgot that I spent years tearing apart labyrinthine corporate contracts in Tokyo. My eyes did not skim the pages. They analyzed the structural phrasing of the paragraphs instantly. The first 2 pages were exactly what he claimed, standard tax disclosures filled with mundane financial jargon. But as my fingers pulled back the third page, my heart slammed against my ribs. Tucked cleverly between a liability waiver and an asset declaration was a highly aggressive power of attorney clause. The legal phrasing was dense, heavily masked by secondary clauses, but the core objective was glaringly obvious to a trained auditor. Richard was not just trying to steal my identity to shield his embezzlement, he was actively targeting my family. The clause granted him unilateral authority to leverage collateral against a property deed located in upstate New York. It was my parents' house. They had spent 30 years paying off that mortgage, working grueling hours to ensure they owned their home outright. Richard had somehow obtained their property parcel numbers and embedded them into a collateralized loan agreement. If I signed that page, I would be legally authorizing him to take out a massive multi-million-dollar fraudulent loan using my parents' debt-free home as the primary collateral. When he and Yumi vanished to Tokyo with the stolen Takahashi funds, the bank would immediately foreclose on the property, throwing my elderly parents onto the street. A violent tremor threatened to shake my hands, but I forced my muscles to remain completely still. I was trapped in an impossible standoff. If I refused to sign the documents, Richard would instantly know something was wrong. He would realize the naive wife routine was compromised. He might accelerate his flight risk, liquidate everything today, and disappear before I had enough time to package the federal evidence. But if I signed the paper, I would be signing my parents' execution warrant. Richard turned around holding his steaming mug. He looked at his watch, clicking his tongue in annoyance. He told me to hurry up, citing a 9 o'clock meeting with the executive board that he could not miss. He stepped closer, hovering over my shoulder to intimidate me into compliance. I needed an exit strategy, and I needed it in less than 10 seconds. I looked at the freshly brewed French press sitting on the edge of the marble island. The glass carafe was filled to the brim with scalding dark liquid. I picked up the pen, positioning the metal tip just above the signature line. I let out a soft manufactured sigh, complaining that the pen ink seemed to be skipping. I reached across the documents with my left hand, aiming directly for the heavy glass carafe. I did not just bump it. I executed a precise, calculated strike against the base of the metal frame. The French press toppled over instantly. The glass shattered against the hard marble. A massive tidal wave of boiling pitch-black coffee flooded directly over the entire stack of legal documents. The dark liquid instantly soaked through the thick paper, melting the printed text and completely obliterating the signature lines, the property parcel numbers, and the notary stamps. The documents were instantly reduced to a useless, soaking wet pile of ruined pulp. Richard froze. For a split second, the air in the kitchen was entirely sucked out of the room. I gasped loudly, jumping back and covering my mouth with my hands, apologizing profusely for my clumsiness. I grabbed a kitchen towel and frantically dabbed at the ruined mess, making sure to smear the wet ink even further across the pages until nothing was legible. The charming, collected executive facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. Richard let out a guttural, explosive roar of pure rage. The sound was terrifying, stripping away every ounce of his polished corporate identity. His face turned a deep, violent shade of crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched collar. He lunged forward, grabbing a ceramic breakfast plate filled with eggs and hurling it violently across the room. The heavy plate slammed against the custom subway tile wall, exploding into sharp white shards that rained down across the hardwood floor. Food splattered across the pristine cabinets. I shrank back against the refrigerator, maintaining my wide-eyed, terrified expression, while internally I remained completely cold and detached. Richard pointed a shaking finger at my face. He screamed that I was a useless, clumsy liability. He cursed my sheer incompetence, shouting that it would take his legal team 3 days to draft a new set of notarized documents. He slammed his fists onto the marble counter, his chest heaving with uncontrollable fury. He did not bother cleaning up the shattered porcelain or the ruined food. He simply grabbed his leather briefcase, turned on his heel, and stormed out of the kitchen. The heavy oak front door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows in their frames. Seconds later, the screeching tires of his sports car echoed down the driveway as he sped away. I stood completely alone in the wrecked kitchen. I looked at the shattered plate on the floor, then at the soaking wet, illegible documents sitting in a pool of cold coffee. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the rush of adrenaline settle into a sharp, tactical calm. My parents' home was safe for now. I had bought myself at least 72 hours before his lawyers could replace the paperwork. My counterattack had officially begun, and Richard had no idea that his explosive anger had just given me the exact window of opportunity I needed to orchestrate his ultimate destruction. I spent the next 48 hours playing the role of the terrified, apologetic wife. I cleaned the shattered porcelain from the kitchen floor, scrubbed the dried coffee from the marble island, and sent Richard a perfectly crafted text message begging for his forgiveness. He responded with a single thumbs-up emoji. The silence that followed was entirely predictable. Richard was punishing me. He thrived on control, and ignoring me was his favorite method of reinforcing his dominance. By Saturday afternoon, he had seamlessly transitioned back into his charming public persona. We were scheduled to attend a family barbecue at the upscale Connecticut estate belonging to his sister Lauren and her husband Dion. Richard drove us in his sports car, the tension thick in the leather-scented air. He warned me not to be clumsy around his family and demanded I make a good impression. I nodded silently, staring out the window at the passing trees, my mind analyzing the encrypted data I had locked away in my closet. Lauren greeted us at the front door of her sprawling modern farmhouse, holding a crystal glass of champagne. Lauren was a carbon copy of Richard, sharing his ruthless arrogance and insatiable need for social validation. She kissed her brother on both cheeks, and offered me a tight, condescending smile that barely masked her disdain. She immediately dragged Richard away to introduce him to some venture capitalist neighbors, leaving me standing alone in the foyer. I made my way to the backyard patio, where a catered barbecue was in full swing. Wealthy executives and their impeccably dressed spouses mingled around the infinity pool. I grabbed a sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself near the edge of the terrace, observing the crowd. I was a corporate intelligence auditor. I did not just attend parties. I analyzed threat vectors and mapped out power dynamics. Lauren approached me a few minutes later with a group of her country club friends. She thrived on performing her superiority, and I was her favorite prop. She loudly introduced me to the group, making sure to emphasize that I was a simple freelancer who mostly stayed home to manage the house. She asked me how my little hobbies were going, her voice dripping with venomous pity. She loudly wondered why Richard had not brought his new brilliant Japanese client Yumi to the barbecue instead. Lauren claimed Yumi was the kind of sophisticated, high-powered executive that Richard truly needed by his side to elevate his career. I maintained a warm, vacant smile. I agreed with Lauren, completely praising Yumi's undeniable business acumen. I watched the disappointment flash across Lauren's face when her insults failed to break my composure. I knew exactly how to starve a narcissist of the reaction they craved. Before Lauren could launch another verbal assault, a deep, commanding voice interrupted the circle. Dion stepped onto the patio, carrying a tray of freshly grilled steaks. Dion was a towering, athletic African-American man with a brilliant analytical mind. He worked as a senior forensic accountant for a massive federal regulatory firm. He was quiet, fiercely intelligent, and universally respected. He was also the only person in this family who saw right through Richard's flawless facade. Dion offered a polite nod to Lauren's friends before turning his sharp, observant gaze directly to me. He asked if I could help him carry a case of wine up from the basement cellar. It was a perfectly executed extraction. Lauren rolled her eyes, muttering something about me finally making myself useful, and turned back to her friends. I followed Dion through the pristine kitchen and down a flight of oak stairs into the climate-controlled wine cellar. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us, completely cutting off the noise of the party above. The temperature dropped and the air smelled heavily of cork and aged wood. I reached for a bottle of Cabernet, assuming he actually needed help carrying the wine. Dion did not look at the wine racks. He turned to face me, his posture shifting from the relaxed host to the intense, calculating investigator. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at me with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He told me to drop the clueless housewife act. I froze, my hand hovering inches from a dusty bottle of red wine. My corporate training screamed at me to deny everything to maintain my cover and to feign complete confusion. But I looked into Dion's eyes and recognized the unmistakable gaze of a predator who had just cornered his prey. Dion lowered his voice to a harsh, tactical whisper. He told me he knew Richard was funneling money into offshore accounts. He explained that his federal firm had been running routine compliance checks on tech executives, and Richard's recent wire transfers had triggered a massive internal red flag. Dion had quietly pulled the raw data himself to protect his wife's family name from a public scandal. I had spent the last 3 nights tracking a labyrinth of shell companies based in the Cayman Islands. My heart slammed against my ribs. I kept my face entirely expressionless, waiting for him to play his final card. Dion stepped closer, his voice dropping even further. He told me he saw my name on the executive signature lines. He knew Richard was framing me. Dion despised his brother-in-law. He hated Richard's blatant racism, his unchecked narcissism, and the toxic influence he had over Lauren. Dion was a man of absolute justice, and he refused to let an innocent woman take the fall for a megalomaniac's financial crimes. He reached into the pocket of his tailored slacks and pulled out a small encrypted titanium USB drive. He held it out to me in the dim light of the cellar. Dion explained that the drive contained the complete forensic audit of Richard's domestic bank accounts, tracing the exact origin of the stolen Takahashi funds before they were washed through international cryptocurrency exchanges. It was the missing link I needed to prove Richard was the sole architect of the embezzlement. Dion could not officially submit the evidence without breaking federal privacy laws and risking his own career, but he knew I could use it to destroy Richard legally. I looked at the heavy titanium drive resting in his palm. This was not a trap. This was a lifeline. Dion was handing me the ultimate weapon to sever the head of the snake. I dropped my naive facade instantly. My posture straightened, my shoulders squared, and the vacant warmth vanished from my eyes. I met Dion's gaze with the cold, lethal intensity of a trained corporate intelligence operative. I reached out and took the USB drive from his hand, my fingers wrapping tightly around the cold metal. I spoke to him in a sharp, authoritative tone he had never heard me use before. I told him I already had the offshore routing numbers and the encrypted chat logs proving the affair with Yumi. I promised him that if he kept Lauren out of the crossfire, I would ensure Richard never saw the outside of a federal penitentiary. We grabbed 2 bottles of Cabernet and walked back up the stairs into the sunlight, stepping seamlessly back into the roles of the quiet wife and the gracious host, ready to burn Richard's empire to the ground. The rest of the barbecue passed in a blur of fake smiles and meaningless corporate chatter. I played my part flawlessly, laughing at Lauren's condescending jokes and serving potato salad to wives who thought my biggest daily challenge was choosing a fabric softener. By Tuesday morning, the house was entirely mine. Richard had left at 7 for a breakfast meeting with the Takahashi executives, taking his arrogant swagger out the front door. I locked the deadbolt, pulled the heavy curtains shut, and went straight to my encrypted server. Dion's titanium USB drive was a goldmine. It did not just contain the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. Hidden deep within the metadata of the audit files was a tiny, encrypted digital footprint indicating that Richard was paying an exorbitant premium for a physical security deposit installation. The billing address was not a bank. It was our own residential address. Richard was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He knew digital files could be hacked, corrupted, or subpoenaed by federal authorities. He needed physical handwritten ledgers to keep track of the extortion payouts and the real-world assets he was purchasing through the shell companies. I walked into his home office, a dark, masculine room, smelling of expensive leather and blind ambition. I stood in the center of the room, closing my eyes and visualizing the architectural blueprints of the house. I mentally measured the interior square footage of the office against the exterior dimensions of the hallway. There was a 12-inch discrepancy on the west wall. I approached the massive floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelf filled with unread biographies and leather-bound legal texts. I began pulling the books out one by one, feeling along the back panel of the heavy wooden structure. My fingers brushed against a tiny concealed metal latch hidden behind a copy of The Art of War. I pressed the latch hard. The entire center column of the bookshelf disengaged with a soft pneumatic hiss, swinging outward on hidden hinges. Recessed into the drywall was a matte black military-grade biometric safe. It featured a thumbprint scanner and a secondary 10-digit numerical keypad. Richard had likely assumed that even if a burglar found the safe, they would never bypass the dual-layer security. He underestimated my training. During my years in Tokyo, I specialized in defeating consumer-grade physical security measures. I retrieved a small specialized kit from my hidden stash. I brushed a fine layer of ultraviolet responsive powder over the keypad and illuminated it with a portable UV light. 4 numbers glowed brightly, revealing the digits 0, 2, 4, and 8. I ran the possible combinations through my mind. Richard was a narcissist who thrived on his own perceived cleverness, but he was also deeply predictable. He would use a date significant to his ultimate victory. August 24th. The exact date he and Yumi opened their first fraudulent offshore account in Cyprus. I punched in the numbers. The keypad flashed green, but the biometric lock remained engaged. I needed his fingerprint. I did not panic. I calmly walked to the master bathroom and retrieved a strip of clear lifting tape and the high-density lifting powder I kept for emergencies. I found a crystal whiskey glass Richard had used late last night sitting abandoned on his nightstand. I dusted the smooth glass, revealing a perfect high-resolution print of his right thumb. I carefully extracted the print, using the lifting tape, returning to the office, and pressing the captured print against the biometric scanner. The heavy steel bolts retracted with a loud, satisfying clack. I pulled the heavy door open. Inside rested a stack of black leather-bound ledger books and a cheap prepaid burner phone. I grabbed the first ledger and opened it. The pages were filled with Richard's meticulous handwriting detailing every single illicit wire transfer, bribe, and corporate kickback he had executed over the past 2 years. This was the physical map of his entire criminal enterprise. It was the undeniable physical proof that he was the sole architect of the fraud, completely exonerating me. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and activated a high-speed document scanning application. I worked with methodical robotic speed, photographing every single page, ensuring the lighting was perfect and the text was razor sharp. I moved to the burner phone, powering it on. It was completely unprotected, likely because Richard assumed the safe itself was impenetrable. The phone contained dozens of text messages to a private jet charter company, confirming non-extradition flight paths out of the country scheduled for exactly 6 weeks from today. I had just finished photographing the flight confirmation numbers when the unmistakable guttural roar of Richard's sports car engine echoed through the front windows. My blood ran ice cold. He was not supposed to be home for another 6 hours. The heavy mechanical rumble of the garage door opening vibrated through the floorboards. I had less than 60 seconds before he walked through the front door. My heart slammed frantically against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. I shoved the burner phone back into the exact corner of the safe where I had found it. I stacked the leather-bound ledgers, aligning the spines perfectly so they looked entirely untouched. I slammed the heavy steel door of the safe shut, ensuring the biometric lock engaged and flashed red. I pushed the mahogany bookshelf back into place, listening for the sharp click of the hidden latch securing itself. I grabbed the scattered books and shoved them rapidly back onto the shelves, desperate to recreate the exact chaotic order Richard kept them in. The heavy oak front door groaned open downstairs. I heard Richard's heavy footsteps hit the hardwood floor of the foyer. He yelled my name, his voice tight with frustration and impatience. I snatched a microfiber dusting cloth from the supply closet in the hallway and frantically began wiping down the wooden banister. I forced my breathing to slow down, pasting a look of mild, agreeable surprise onto my face. The heavy footsteps thudded aggressively up the staircase. Richard rounded the corner. His face flushed, his tie loosened. He looked angry and panicked, clutching his leather briefcase tightly against his side. He stopped at the top of the stairs, staring at me, holding the dusting cloth. I offered him a warm, questioning smile, asking him why he was home so early from his executive breakfast. I asked if he wanted me to brew a fresh pot of coffee. Richard glared at me, his chest heaving slightly. He told me he forgot a critical physical file for his afternoon presentation. He ordered me to go downstairs and make the coffee, snapping that he did not have time for my domestic chatter. He pushed past me, walking directly toward the home office. I turned and walked down the stairs, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm in my ears. I listened to the heavy oak door of his office click shut behind him. I walked into the kitchen and gripped the edge of the marble island, letting out a long, shaky breath. I had done it. I had the entire blueprint of his destruction securely uploaded to my encrypted cloud server. Richard thought he was walking into his office to retrieve a file, completely unaware that his entire criminal empire had just been captured, cataloged, and weaponized against him. The trap was fully set. Now I just needed to tighten the snare. Richard left the house 30 minutes later, rushing back to the city with his precious physical file clutched tightly in his grip. I spent the remainder of the morning backing up the encrypted data to 3 separate cloud servers located in jurisdictions immune to federal subpoenas. I was reviewing the digital ledgers on my laptop when the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the silent house. I checked the security camera feed on my tablet. Standing on my porch was Yumi. She wore a pristine white designer trench coat, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon. She held a black leather document portfolio against her chest. She looked every inch the high-powered executive ready to conquer the world. She also looked like a woman who felt entirely too comfortable showing up at her lover's house in broad daylight. I closed my laptop, smoothed the front of my floral apron, and walked to the foyer. I opened the door with the bright, welcoming smile. Yumi offered a crisp nod. She told me she was in the area inspecting a potential commercial real estate site for Takahashi Industries, and realized she needed to drop off a highly confidential portfolio for Richard. She claimed it contained hard copies requiring his physical signature by tomorrow morning. I knew exactly what the portfolio contained. It was likely a secondary set of the fraudulent shell company contracts, a backup plan, in case Richard encountered any issues with the first batch I had ruined with coffee. I stepped aside and graciously invited her inside. I told her Richard was at the office, but she was more than welcome to leave the documents on his desk. Yumi stepped over the threshold, her expensive perfume instantly invading my space. She handed me the leather portfolio with a dismissive gesture. Instead of leaving, she began a slow, deliberate pacing around my living room. She ran her manicured fingers over the edge of my custom velvet sofa. She examined the framed photographs on the mantel, her eyes narrowing as she looked at pictures of Richard and me smiling on our honeymoon. She was marking her territory. She wanted to stand in my home and revel in the fact that she was stealing my husband and my life. Then she started speaking. Not to me, but to herself entirely in Japanese. "This house reeks of suburban mediocrity," Yumi murmured in Japanese, picking up a crystal vase and inspecting the bottom for a brand name. "It is painfully generic. I cannot wait to sell all this cheap trash and burn the rest. She lives like a domesticated animal." I stood near the entryway, maintaining my warm, vacant expression. I clasped my hands together in front of me, ensuring not a single muscle in my face betrayed my comprehension. I asked Yumi in bright, cheerful English if she would like a cup of tea before she braved the afternoon traffic back to the city. I mentioned I had a rare imported sencha green tea that a relative had sent from Kyoto. Yumi turned to look at me, a cruel spark dancing in her dark eyes. She accepted the offer, likely wanting to drag out her intrusion just to see how pathetic the domestic wife looked, serving her in her own home. She sat down on the velvet sofa, crossing her long legs. "Hurry up, you simpleton," Yumi whispered in Japanese under her breath as I turned away. "Make yourself useful before we take everything you own." I walked into the kitchen and set the leather portfolio on the counter. I filled the electric kettle and turned it on. Then I walked to the small indoor greenhouse window, where I cultivated a variety of specialized herbs and botanicals. Alongside the basil and thyme, I kept a very specific breed of ornamental nettle. When properly concentrated, the oils from the leaves act as a powerful vasodilator. It is entirely harmless, carrying zero long-term health risks and leaving no toxicological footprint. However, when ingested, it triggers an immediate aggressive histamine response in the body. It causes severe flushing, intense hives, and dramatic uncomfortable swelling of the facial tissues within minutes. I plucked 3 leaves from the plant, crushed them violently in a mortar and pestle, and extracted a few drops of the concentrated oil. I brewed the expensive sencha green tea in a delicate porcelain pot, stealthily stirring the clear botanical extract directly into Yumi's cup. The tea smelled earthy and perfectly normal. I carried the silver tray back into the living room. Yumi was looking at her phone, typing rapidly. I set the cup in front of her. I poured my own cup of unlaced tea and sat in the armchair opposite the sofa. Yumi picked up the porcelain cup, inhaling the aroma before taking a long, deliberate sip. She offered a tight smile in English, complimenting the brew. "At least she is good for boiling water," Yumi muttered in Japanese, taking another large sip. "I suppose every maid needs a specialized skill." I smiled gently, asking her polite, mundane questions about the traffic on the interstate and the weather in the city. I watched the clock on the mantel. 5 minutes passed. Yumi reached up and scratched the side of her neck. A faint, angry red patch began to bloom just beneath her jawline. She took another sip of the tea, shifting uncomfortably on the velvet cushions. "Is it warm in here?" Yumi asked in English, her voice tight. She pulled at the collar of her pristine white trench coat. I looked at her with wide, innocent eyes. I told her the air conditioning was set to a cool 70 degrees, but I could lower it if she felt overheated. By minute 8, the botanical extract hit her bloodstream with full force. The red patches on her neck spread aggressively upward, crawling across her cheeks and forehead. Her skin erupted in massive raised hives. Her flawless complexion turned into a bright, inflamed, patchy mess. She dropped the teacup onto the saucer with a loud clatter, her hands flying to her face. Her eyelids began to puff up rapidly. Her lips swelled, losing their sharp painted outline and turning puffy and distorted. The transformation was spectacular. The untouchable, elegant corporate executive was disintegrating right in front of my eyes, reduced to a bloated, itching, panicked mess. Yumi gasped, scratching frantically at her arms and neck. She sprang up from the sofa, her breathing turning shallow from pure panic. She demanded to know where the bathroom was. I played the role of the horrified, deeply concerned hostess perfectly. I gasped loudly, rushing to her side and pointing her toward the hallway powder room. I listened as the bathroom door slammed shut. Seconds later, a muffled, horrified shriek echoed through the heavy wood. Yumi had seen her reflection in the mirror. She looked like a monster. Her immaculate beauty, the primary weapon she used to seduce Richard and secure her power, had been completely stripped away in less than 10 minutes. The bathroom door flew open. Yumi stumbled out, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. Her face was fiercely swollen, her eyes reduced to tiny slits amidst the angry red hives. She did not even bother putting her designer heels back on properly. She shoved her bare feet into the shoes and scrambled toward the front door. I rushed after her, grabbing my phone and frantically offering to call an ambulance or drive her to an urgent care clinic. I projected absolute terror and concern, begging her to let me help. Yumi waved her hands wildly in the air, batting me away. She shrieked in broken English that she needed to leave immediately, terrified that anyone, especially Richard, might see her looking so grotesque. She threw open the heavy oak door and sprinted down the driveway toward her luxury sedan, scratching wildly at her neck and arms. I stood on the front porch, wrapping my arms around myself to play the part of the shaken housewife. I watched her car speed recklessly out of the neighborhood, swerving slightly as she clawed at her own face. I stepped back inside and closed the front door. The look of sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes was permanently burned into my memory. I walked back into the living room, picked up the silver tray, and calmly carried the empty teacups to the kitchen sink. The first strike against the mistress was flawlessly executed. Yumi had walked into my home expecting to assert her dominance and mock my existence. Instead, she fled like a frightened, hideous animal. I washed the porcelain cups, thoroughly wiping away the last traces of the botanical extract. The board was set, the enemies were scrambling, and my trap was closing tighter with every passing second. I dried my hands on a linen towel and walked upstairs to the master bedroom. I needed to shift my focus from physical sabotage to corporate espionage. The botanical allergen had served its purpose by shattering Yumi's confidence and disrupting their immediate timeline. Now I needed to dismantle her professional armor. I waited until midnight. Richard was out at a high-stakes networking dinner, schmoozing with Wall Street venture capitalists to secure his post-embezzlement future. He had texted earlier to say he would not be home until past 2 in the morning. I locked the bedroom door, pulled out my encrypted laptop from the false floorboard, and booted up a heavily masked virtual private network. I routed my connection through a series of proxy servers in Switzerland, Brazil, and finally a secure node in Chiyoda City, Tokyo. I opened a dark web messaging interface I had not utilized since my active duty days. I typed in a specific alphanumeric sequence, reaching out to my former intelligence handler Kenji, who was an elite independent data broker who specialized in infiltrating the impenetrable digital fortresses of Japanese conglomerates. Kenji responded within 60 seconds. I bypassed the standard pleasantries and sent him Yumi's full name, her current corporate title, and her employee identification number, which I had extracted from Richard's cloned phone. I requested a deep-dive forensic sweep of her entire employment history at Takahashi Industries. I wanted unredacted human resources files, sealed board meeting minutes, and any erased disciplinary actions. I offered him a substantial fee from a hidden cryptocurrency wallet I maintained for emergencies. Kenji accepted the contract and told me to keep the secure channel open. I sat in the dark for 2 hours, watching the green cursor blink on the black screen. At exactly 1:45 in the morning, the data packet arrived. I downloaded the encrypted zip file and initiated the decryption sequence. As I parsed through the translated documents, a sinister, fascinating pattern emerged. Yumi was not a rising corporate star. She was a seasoned financial predator. 3 years ago, Yumi had been the central figure in a massive procurement scandal at the Osaka branch of Takahashi Industries. She had siphoned $4 million by creating phantom supply chain vendors. The internal audit had caught her red-handed. However, instead of handing her over to the Japanese authorities, the senior executives buried the investigation. The sealed board minutes revealed the truth. Yumi had been engaging in a long-term affair with the regional vice president. When the audit trapped her, she threatened to expose the vice president's illegal kickbacks to the media. To prevent a catastrophic public relations disaster, the board swept her embezzlement under the rug, quietly transferred the vice president to a defunct subsidiary, and promoted Yumi to the North American division just to get her out of the country. She was a corporate exile weaponizing blackmail to survive. She was using the exact same playbook on Richard, but this time the stakes were $80 million. I was so deeply engrossed in reading the translated blackmail transcripts that I completely missed the sound of tires rolling into the driveway. My situational awareness had slipped for a fraction of a second. I heard the front door click shut downstairs, followed by the heavy, deliberate thud of Richard's dress shoes on the hardwood floor. I slammed the laptop shut, severing the proxy connection instantly. I shoved the machine under the mattress and grabbed my personal cell phone from the nightstand. I dialed my own voicemail and held the phone to my ear, speaking in a hushed, frantic whisper in English. The bedroom door handle rattled, then the door swung open. Richard stood in the doorway, his tie undone, smelling faintly of expensive scotch and cigar smoke. His eyes narrowed instantly as he saw me sitting up in bed, clutching my phone in the dark. I forced my voice to tremble, perfectly executing a sudden, breathless sob. I spoke into the dead phone line, promising to book a flight immediately and telling the imaginary person on the other end to stay strong. I pulled the phone away from my ear, wiping a fabricated tear from my cheek. Richard flicked on the overhead light, his gaze sweeping the room like a prison warden. He demanded to know who I was speaking to at 2 in the morning. His voice was sharp, laced with a sudden, dangerous paranoia. He stepped closer to the bed, checking the digital clock on the nightstand. I looked up at him with wide, watery eyes. I told him I had just received a devastating phone call from my old college roommate, Allison. I explained that she was currently living in London and had just been diagnosed with an aggressive form of stage 3 breast cancer. I let my voice crack, detailing how terrified she was and how the time zone difference meant she could only call me in the middle of the night. I buried my face in my hands, letting my shoulders shake with practiced, rhythmic sobs. Richard's defensive posture relaxed entirely. The paranoia washed out of his eyes, replaced by a cold, performative sympathy. He sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled me into a stiff hug. He rubbed my back, whispering empty condolences, telling me everything would be fine. He played the supportive husband role to perfection, but I could feel the rigid tension in his chest. He did not care about my fake friend. He was just relieved I had not discovered his criminal enterprise. He told me to get some rest and walked into the master bathroom to shower. I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin. The crisis had been averted, but the dynamic in the house had fundamentally shifted. The next morning, while Richard was at the gym, I ran a routine diagnostic sweep on our home internet network. My blood ran cold. The data logs showed a massive unapproved firmware update executed on the main router at 3 in the morning. Richard had not believed my story entirely. The moment I fell asleep, he had logged into the administrative portal and installed a high-grade digital packet sniffer. It was a stealth monitoring protocol designed to track every single keystroke, website visit, and outgoing message processed through the home network. I was monitoring my movements. He was looking for any sign that the naive housewife was waking up. I smiled at the router blinking innocuously on the living room shelf. If Richard wanted to spy on my internet traffic, I would give him exactly what he wanted to see. I spent the next 3 hours browsing luxury vacation packages to Hawaii, searching for slow cooker recipes, and ordering expensive floral arrangements for my imaginary sick friend in London. I fed his surveillance program a steady diet of boring domestic mediocrity. Behind his back, I routed all my actual intelligence work through a decentralized cellular hotspot hidden in the trunk of my car. Richard had escalated the game to digital warfare. Confident, he held the high ground. He was blindly stepping right into the crosshairs, completely unaware that his surveillance trap was the exact distraction I needed to finalize my alliance with the one man who could tear his financial records to shreds. I met Dion the next afternoon at a bustling, noisy diner on the outskirts of Brooklyn. The loud clatter of silverware, The hiss of the espresso machines and the aggressive chatter of the lunchtime crowd provided the perfect acoustic camouflage against any potential audio bugs. Richard might have slipped into my belongings. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from my brother-in-law. Dayon looked incredibly sharp, his dark eyes radiating intense, analytical focus as he slid a thick manila envelope across the sticky laminate table. Inside the envelope rested the legal weapon we had been drafting over secure channels for the past 48 hours. It was an irrevocable trust agreement. Dion explained the legal architecture of the document with surgical precision. This specific contract was designed to immediately seize and freeze every single domestic asset stock portfolio and liquid account tied to Richard's Social Security number. It would funnel his entire net worth into a blind trust, where I possessed sole administrative and executive authority. Once his signature hit the paper, he would not be able to buy a cup of coffee without my express legal permission. I had to swap the core pages of Richard's fraudulent collateral loan with Dion's trust agreement right in front of his eyes. Dion handed me a mock stack of papers and pulled out a stopwatch. We transformed the diner booth into a training ground for corporate sleight of hand. I practiced the physical swap over and over. I folded the pages, slid them under the table, and pulled the dummy sheets into my lap. Dayon corrected my posture, instructing me to use my body mechanics shoulder angles and direct eye contact to draw Richard's attention entirely away from my hands. I spent 2 grueling hours perfecting the misdirection until the movement became pure, flawless muscle memory. I returned to our quiet suburban home and waited for the execution. Richard walked through the front door at exactly 6 in the evening. He carried a fresh stack of documents printed on thick, high-quality legal paper. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched, and his eyes rapidly scanned the kitchen for any potential hazards. He had certainly not forgotten the ruined paperwork from earlier in the week. He slammed the papers onto the dry, completely cleared marble island. He ordered me to sign them immediately, his voice hard, authoritative, and leaving absolutely no room for argument or delay. I took a slow, steadying breath and approached the kitchen island. I held the hidden trust pages against my stomach, perfectly concealed beneath the loose folds of my oversized knit cardigan. Richard stood directly across from me, his gaze locked intensely onto my hands. He crossed his arms over his chest and began tapping his expensive leather shoe impatiently against the hardwood floor. The air in the room felt impossibly heavy, charged with a lethal static electricity. I picked up the silver pen he offered. I looked down at the first page. It was the exact same aggressive power of attorney clause targeting my parents' home. He was still actively trying to destroy my family to fund his escape with Yumi. I knew I had a fraction of a second to execute the swap, and I needed an absolute foolproof diversion. I looked up from the documents and stared directly into Richard's eyes, projecting a look of profound, heart-wrenching guilt. I let my lower lip tremble. I told him I felt terrible about the argument we had earlier in the week. I let my voice crack, perfectly whispering that I knew how hard he worked for our family and how much pressure he was under at his firm. I reached across the marble island with my right hand, gently touching his wrist, my eyes wide with manufactured adoration and submission. My sudden emotional vulnerability threw his analytical, predatory brain completely off balance. His narcissistic ego practically demanded he absorb the validation. For one crucial, blinding second, his chest puffed out slightly, and he looked at my face instead of my hands, drinking in the sight of his broken, obedient wife apologizing to him. In that exact moment, my left hand moved with lethal, practiced speed. I slid the core pages of the fraudulent loan off the counter and dropped them silently into the deep pocket of my cardigan. Simultaneously, I pushed Dion's trust agreement pages seamlessly into the middle of the stack, perfectly aligning the edges with the top and bottom sheets. I withdrew my right hand from his wrist, picked up the pen, and quickly signed the bottom of the final page. I pushed the document back across the counter toward him, offering a weak, watery smile. Richard snatched the stack of papers eagerly. He flipped straight to the back page, verifying my signature on the dotted line. He did not bother reading the preceding pages. His boundless arrogance convinced him he had successfully bullied his naive wife into absolute submission. He pulled a second pen from his breast pocket and signed his own name right below mine, legally binding the document with quick, aggressive strokes. He let out a harsh, victorious laugh, completely mocking my emotional apology. He told me to stop acting so pathetic and needy, ordering me to focus on being a supportive partner instead of a burden. He shoved the documents back into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. He turned his back to me and walked upstairs to change his clothes, entirely unaware that he had just willingly signed away his entire net worth. He had locked his own financial throat in a vice, handing me the key while insulting my intelligence. I stood in the kitchen, feeling the heavy, fraudulent pages burning a hole in my cardigan pocket, smiling as the steel jaws of my legal trap snapped perfectly shut. 48 hours later, the battlefield shifted to the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan. The Global Finance Charity Gala was the pinnacle of the corporate social calendar. It was also the exact arena Richard needed to secure the final optics for his massive embezzlement scheme. He wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo, radiating the obnoxious confidence of a man who believed he had just legally conquered the world and outsmarted everyone in his path. I wore an emerald green silk evening gown, my hair swept up into an elegant chignon, playing the role of his flawless decorative accessory. Richard gripped my elbow tightly as we navigated the crowded foyer, his fingers digging into my skin with possessive aggression. He leaned down, his breath smelling of expensive gin and strong mints, whispering harsh instructions directly into my ear. He told me to find a quiet corner table near the floral arrangements and stay firmly put for the entire evening. He ordered me not to speak to any of his clients, claiming my lack of corporate knowledge would only embarrass him in front of the Takahashi Industries executive board. He gave me a patronizing pat on the back and vanished into the sea of wealthy investors. I did not walk to the corner table. I did not shrink into the shadows of the floral arrangements as commanded. The moment Richard's velvet tuxedo disappeared into the dense crowd, my submissive housewife facade completely evaporated. I stood tall and surveyed the ballroom with the predatory precision of a corporate intelligence auditor. I located my targets instantly. Standing near the massive central ice sculpture was a tight, exclusive circle of senior board members from Takahashi Industries. They were the men who controlled the $80 million Richard was planning to steal, and they held the key to his immediate financial destruction. I glided across the ballroom, my posture projecting absolute, undeniable confidence. I did not wait for a formal introduction. I stepped directly into their exclusive circle, offering a warm, brilliant smile that demanded their immediate attention. The executives paused their conversation, looking at me with mild surprise. I introduced myself as Richard's wife, extending my hand with firm professional grace. They quickly masked their confusion with polite greetings, assuming I was there to offer empty pleasantries about the charity auction. They were entirely wrong. I started the conversation smoothly, praising their recent expansion into the North American market. I spoke exclusively in English, maintaining my cover as the monolingual American spouse. Then I pivoted with lethal calculation. I adopted a look of mild, innocent confusion, tilting my head slightly. I asked the senior director of risk management a highly specific, devastatingly targeted financial question. I told him Richard had been working late every single night, stressing over the complex offshore liquidity transfers required to float the new Takahashi merger. I let my voice drop into a hushed, conspiratorial tone. I innocently asked if it was standard corporate practice for Takahashi Industries to require their regional financial officers to leverage heavily collateralized domestic assets against unverified overseas shell companies just to clear the quarterly compliance audits. The air in the circle instantly froze. The polite, superficial smiles vanished from the executives' faces, replaced by a cold, rigid shock. In the high-stakes world of international finance, the words I just used were massive, blaring sirens indicating unauthorized debt and severe operational insolvency. I had just casually described the exact mechanics of a massive money laundering operation under the guise of an ignorant wife seeking reassurance about her husband's stressful workload. The senior director of risk management stared at me, his jaw tightening visibly. He asked me to clarify what I meant by offshore shell companies. I gave a soft, embarrassed laugh, waving my hand dismissively, as if I had just realized I spoke out of turn. I apologized profusely, claiming I must have misunderstood Richard's late-night venting. I said I was terrible with numbers and that Richard always handled the complicated banking structures on his own. I excused myself gracefully, wishing them a wonderful evening, and walked away. I did not need to look back. My corporate training told me exactly what was happening behind me. I had just injected a lethal dose of financial paranoia directly into the veins of the Takahashi board. Those executives were not going to enjoy their expensive dinners. They were going to immediately contact their compliance teams in New York and Tokyo. They were going to launch a quiet, aggressive internal audit of Richard's liquidity before authorizing any further capital transfers. I had effectively stalled his $80 million payout using nothing but 3 carefully constructed sentences. I made my way across the ballroom and slipped into the lavish marble-lined women's restroom to reapply my lipstick. The heavy mahogany door swung shut, muffling the chaotic noise of the gala. The restroom was completely empty save for the soft jazz playing through the ceiling speakers. I pulled a gold tube of lipstick from my clutch and leaned toward the brightly lit mirror. The bathroom door violently slammed open. Yumi marched into the room, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She slammed the deadbolt shut, locking us inside. She wore a stunning crimson designer gown, but her elegant posture was ruined by her aggressive, erratic movements. She stormed across the marble floor, stopping mere inches from my back. She glared at my reflection in the mirror, her chest heaving with rage. She abandoned her polite professional persona entirely. She spoke in sharp, vicious English, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. She demanded to know what I had just said to the Takahashi board members. She told me Richard was furious because the executives were suddenly giving him the cold shoulder and asking probing questions about his independent credit lines. Yumi stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use her height and corporate authority to intimidate me into submission. She called me a pathetic, useless housewife. She ordered me to keep my mouth shut and stay away from their business affairs. She threatened to completely destroy my life, claiming I had no idea who I was dealing with or what kind of power she wielded. She spat her words with venom, demanding I answer her. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I finished applying my lipstick with agonizingly slow, deliberate precision. I capped the gold tube and dropped it back into my clutch. I turned around slowly, closing the physical distance between us until I was standing right in her face. I looked directly into her furious, panicked eyes. I did not utter a single syllable. I simply smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, terrifying, utterly knowing smile. It was the smile of an executioner looking at a condemned prisoner. The sheer chilling silence of my response completely broke her aggressive momentum. Yumi faltered, taking a slight involuntary step backward, a flicker of genuine terror crossing her features. I stepped around her frozen body, unlocked the heavy mahogany door, and walked back out into the glittering ballroom, leaving her completely trapped in her own escalating paranoia. I walked back into the glittering ballroom, leaving Yumi trapped in her own paranoia. The jazz band had transitioned into a faster tempo, and the crowd of wealthy investors grew louder, their laughter bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. I picked up a fresh glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself near a massive marble pillar. From this vantage point, I had a clear line of sight to the main exit of the restroom corridor. 2 minutes later, Yumi emerged. Her previous regal posture was completely gone. She practically sprinted across the ballroom floor, her eyes darting around frantically until she spotted Richard. He was deep in conversation with a hedge fund manager, laughing at a joke with his signature arrogant grin. Yumi did not care about corporate etiquette. She grabbed his arm, her manicured fingers digging into his velvet tuxedo jacket. Richard turned, his smile instantly dropping into a scowl of deep annoyance at the public interruption. Yumi whispered something frantic into his ear. Richard glared at me across the crowded room. I simply raised my glass in a silent, polite toast. Richard muttered an abrupt apology to the hedge fund manager. He grabbed Yumi by the elbow and forcefully steered her away from the ballroom floor. They moved quickly toward the private restricted corridors reserved for hotel staff and high-tier VIPs. This was exactly the reaction I had anticipated. Panic breeds carelessness, and careless criminals always seek isolation to argue. I waited exactly 30 seconds before following them. I slipped past the velvet ropes, entering a long, dimly lit hallway lined with heavy oak doors. The noise of the gala faded into a muffled hum. I walked with silent, measured steps, my emerald green gown rustling softly against the thick carpet. At the far end of the corridor, a heavy door clicked shut. A small brass plaque beside it read, "Private Lounge B." I stopped 10 feet away from the door. I opened my evening clutch. Hidden beneath a layer of cosmetic touch-up powder was a piece of hardware I had specially requisitioned from a former contact in the intelligence community. It was a digital micro-recorder no thicker than a credit card, equipped with a high-gain omnidirectional microphone and a secure Bluetooth transmitter. Attached to the corner of the device was a foot-long microfilament wire, completely invisible to the naked eye. I walked directly to the heavy oak door. I knelt on the plush carpet, moving with the fluid precision of a ghost. The gap between the bottom of the door and the floor was barely half an inch. I slid the micro-recorder under the wood, pushing it deep into the private lounge, while keeping a firm grip on the invisible filament wire. I stood up and smoothed my dress. I reached back into my clutch and pulled out a tiny, flesh-colored earpiece, slipping it discreetly into my right ear and covering it with a loose strand of my swept-up hair. I activated the receiver. The live audio feed cracked sharply in my ear, capturing the acoustics of the room with terrifying clarity. Richard and Yumi were screaming at each other in rapid, aggressive Japanese. Yumi was pacing the room, her voice trembling with hysteria. She told Richard that I knew exactly what they were doing. She recounted my targeted questions to the Takahashi board members, her words tripping over themselves in a panic. She demanded they abandon the current timeline and initiate the wire transfers tonight. Richard scoffed loudly, his voice echoing through my earpiece. He called her a paranoid, hysterical fool. He insisted that I was just a stupid, lonely housewife, making ignorant conversation to feel important. He commanded her to calm down and stick to the protocol, asserting his dominance over the operation. Then, driven by his desperate need to maintain absolute control, Richard began outlining the entire criminal blueprint aloud. It was the fatal mistake I had been waiting for. He stated the exact date and time for the final execution. Next Friday precisely at 4 in the afternoon Eastern Standard Time. He confirmed the exact routing numbers for the offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He explicitly verified the total amount of $80 million to be siphoned from the Takahashi corporate reserves. He detailed how the localized banking algorithms would be bypassed using the security clearances Yumi had stolen from her superiors. Yumi was still not satisfied. She demanded to know what would happen if the federal authorities froze the accounts before they cleared international airspace. She asked how he could be so certain I would take the fall without fighting back. Richard let out a dark, cruel laugh. The sound sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. It was the sound of a true sociopath reveling in his own destructive brilliance. I explained his framing strategy with chilling detail. He had already purchased a secondary laptop using untraceable cash. He had spent the last 3 weeks populating its hard drive with forged email chains between my personal email address and the offshore bank managers. He had manufactured digital invoices matching my browsing history. He even had physical security tokens linked directly to the fraudulent accounts. On the morning of their flight to Tokyo, Richard planned to hide the laptop and the security tokens deep inside the spare tire compartment of my car. Once he and Yumi were safely seated in first class, he would use a burner phone to place an anonymous tip to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He would provide the authorities with my exact license plate number and the precise location of the fabricated evidence. I bragged that the FBI would raid our home by dinner time. They would tear my car apart, find the laptop, and immediately arrest me for orchestrating the largest corporate theft in Takahashi history. He told Yumi I would be rotting in a federal holding cell facing decades behind bars while they were drinking champagne over the Pacific Ocean. I stood completely still in the empty hallway, listening to my husband meticulously plot my total annihilation. Every single word was digitally captured, timestamped, and uploaded instantly to my secure cloud server. This was not just circumstantial evidence. This was a definitive, irrefutable confession. It was the ultimate smoking gun wrapped in a bow and handed to me by his own colossal arrogance. I heard the rustle of clothing through the earpiece. Richard told Yumi to fix her makeup and get back to the ballroom before their prolonged absence raised any more suspicion among the board members. My heart beat with a steady, victorious rhythm. Richard thought he had built an inescapable trap for me. He had no idea I had just locked the federal handcuffs around his wrists. The evidence was secured. The timeline was confirmed. The execution phase of my counterattack was about to begin, and I was going to enjoy every single second of his downfall. The ride back to our suburban home from the charity gala was draped in a suffocating, heavy silence. Richard sat rigid in the back of the luxury town car, his mind clearly racing through his final operational checklist. He believed he was merely days away from securing his $80 million prize and discarding me into a federal prison cell. I sat beside him, staring out at the blurred city lights flashing against the rain-slicked window, tightly clutching my evening bag. Inside that small silk purse rested the digital recording of his entire criminal confession. I did not speak. I let him bask in his false sense of absolute supremacy. Wednesday morning arrived with a torrential downpour the sky, a bruised dark gray that perfectly matched the tension inside our home. Richard skipped his usual elaborate breakfast routine. He needed to initiate the preliminary wire transfers from his personal domestic accounts to the offshore shell entities he had established in my name. This was a critical step to cover his tracks and ensure he had liquid travel capital before executing the massive corporate theft scheduled for Friday. He locked himself inside his home office without saying a word to me. I stood in the kitchen meticulously chopping vegetables for a slow cooker meal I had no intention of eating. I kept my hands steady, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Dion had assured me the irrevocable trust documents I tricked Richard into signing would fully activate at precisely 9 in the morning. At that exact moment, the banking algorithms would freeze every single liquid asset investment portfolio and credit line tied to Richard's social security number. He would be locked out of his own financial existence. At 9:15, a loud, violent crash echoed from the second floor. A heavy object slammed against the hardwood floor directly above my head. The home office door was thrown open with enough force to crack the hallway drywall. Heavy, aggressive footsteps pounded down the oak staircase. I kept my eyes focused on the cutting board, making sure my breathing remained shallow and controlled. Richard stormed into the kitchen like a rabid animal. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. His eyes were wide, darting erratically, completely stripped of his usual polished corporate arrogance. He held his laptop in his right hand, turning the screen toward me. A bright red security banner from our primary financial institution blared across the display. Access denied. Asset freeze initiated. He slammed the heavy laptop onto the marble island, shattering a ceramic mixing bowl. Shards of pottery flew across the counter. He lunged forward and grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into my skin with bruising, terrifying force. He shoved me backward until my spine hit the cold stainless steel of the refrigerator, his imposing height shadowing me completely. He screamed that every single one of his accounts was locked under an administrative trust bearing my explicit signature. Richard completely abandoned any pretense of a loving marriage. He leaned in his face inches from mine, his breath ragged and sharp. He told me I was playing a highly dangerous game with a man who could crush my very existence. He threatened to completely ruin my life. He explicitly stated he would frame me for massive corporate embezzlement, ensuring I spent the rest of my days rotting in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He did not stop there. He invoked the power of attorney clause he wrongly believed he still possessed. He swore he would liquidate my parents' retirement fund and foreclose on their home. He promised to throw them onto the street by the end of the month if I did not reverse the trust immediately. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a vicious, threatening growl. He used his signature toxic line, the same words he used to belittle me on the night of the coffee spill. He told me he was a human being, and I was a human being, and I needed to figure out my place and step aside before he annihilated my entire family. This was the critical moment. I needed to feed his monumental, fragile ego. I needed him to believe that his aggressive intimidation tactics were working flawlessly. I let my knees buckle slightly, sliding down the cold metal of the refrigerator until I hit the floor. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing a stream of hot, panicked tears down my cheeks. I let my entire body tremble violently. I looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, hyperventilating as if I were having a severe panic attack. I stammered through my tears, playing the absolute fool perfectly. I sobbed that I had no idea what a blind trust was. I cried that I must have misunderstood the dense legal documents he forced me to sign earlier in the week. I claimed a bank representative had called me about a routine security update, and I must have verbally authorized the wrong account restructuring because I was so terrible with financial jargon. I begged him not to hurt my parents. I grabbed the hem of his tailored suit pants, sobbing uncontrollably. I pleaded with him to give me a chance to fix my stupid mistake. I told him the bank required 24 hours to process any administrative reversal on a locked asset trust. I begged him to let me call the bank manager tomorrow morning to undo the error. I promised I would sign everything back over to him and step away completely exactly as he demanded. Richard stared down at my weeping, pathetic display. His narcissistic brain processed the scene exactly as I intended. He could not fathom that his docile, subservient wife possessed the intellect to orchestrate a complex financial trap. He believed his sheer masculine dominance had terrified me into total submission. He truly believed I was a clumsy, incompetent idiot who had accidentally triggered a banking security protocol. He forcefully kicked my hands away from his legs. He stepped back, straightening his expensive suit jacket, his chest heaving as he regained his breath. He looked at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He told me I had exactly 24 hours to unravel my spectacular mess. He promised that if the accounts were not fully accessible by tomorrow evening, my parents would lose their house, and he would personally hand the fabricated embezzlement evidence to the federal authorities. He turned on his heel and marched out of the kitchen, leaving me crumpled on the floor. The moment the heavy front door slammed shut, my trembling ceased entirely. My tears stopped instantly. I stood up from the cold kitchen floor, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. I wiped my face with a damp cloth, my expression shifting back to a cold, predatory calm. Richard thought he had just issued a terrifying ultimatum. He had no idea he had just granted me the exact 24-hour window I required to finalize his total destruction. The clock was officially ticking, and I held every single card. The clock was officially ticking, and I held every single card. I slipped out the back door and drove to a secluded parking lot 2 towns over. I abandoned my vehicle there, dodging Richard's hardwired GPS tracker, and hailed a cash-only taxi to Dion's suburban estate. Dion texted earlier that Lauren was attending an overnight wellness retreat in the Hamptons. The empty house provided the perfect environment to finalize the federal dossier. Arriving after nightfall, Dion ushered me through the side garage into his soundproofed basement office. The room was a fortress of multiple monitors, encrypted servers, and secure physical filing cabinets. Dion had already started compiling the forensic architecture of Richard's money laundering network. I pulled my encrypted microdrive from my pocket and plugged it into his isolated network terminal. We spent 4 hours working in absolute silence. I transferred the pristine audio recording of Richard and Yumi confessing in the lounge. Dion matched the audio timestamps perfectly against the offshore routing numbers extracted from Richard's phone. We cross-referenced the forged signature on the fraudulent property loan against my verified legal signatures, building an impenetrable wall of evidence. Every digital file, physical ledger, photograph, and threatening text message was meticulously packaged into a single, devastating digital warhead. Dion applied his federal compliance seals to the documentation. His forensic stamp guaranteed the FBI would classify our submission as an urgent corporate espionage priority. We were organizing the final index of the dossier when a sharp, unexpected noise shattered the quiet focus of the basement. The heavy oak door at the top of the stairs clicked open. My blood ran cold. Dion froze, his hands hovering over his keyboard. The wellness retreat was supposed to last until tomorrow afternoon. Lauren shouldn't be here. Heavy, uneven footsteps descended the wooden staircase. The scent of gin and overpowering floral perfume wafted into the basement office. Dion instantly reached for the monitor power switch, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Lauren stumbled into the office doorway clutching a half-empty martini glass. She wore a wrinkled silk designer dress, her makeup slightly smeared from a night of heavy drinking. Her bleary eyes scanned the dimly lit room, landing directly on me, sitting shoulder to shoulder with her husband behind his massive desk. The confusion on her face lasted for barely a second before it morphed into a mask of pure vicious rage. Lauren shared her brother's toxic, narcissistic traits. Her brain bypassed any logical explanation for my presence and immediately jumped to the most dramatic, ego-driven conclusion possible. She slammed her martini glass down on a nearby filing cabinet, shattering the crystal stem, and let out a piercing scream that echoed off the concrete walls. Lauren pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, accusing me of sleeping with her husband. She screamed that she always knew I was a deceitful, gold-digging fraud who used my quiet housewife act to mask my true colors. She hurled every vile insult she could muster, calling me a pathetic homewrecker desperately trying to upgrade from her brother to a real man. Dion stood up instantly, stepping in front of the desk, with his hands raised in a calming gesture. He spoke in a firm, measured tone, ordering her to lower her voice and let him explain that she was completely misunderstanding the situation. Lauren refused to listen. She laughed a harsh, cruel laugh, stepping backward toward the staircase. She told Dion he was the gullible fool for falling for my pathetic manipulation. She declared that she was going to expose my disgusting affair to the entire family and ruin my reputation forever. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her smartphone. My heart hammered against my ribs with terrifying force. If Lauren called Richard right now, the entire operation would collapse instantly. Richard would realize I was not sitting at home crying in a state of terrified submission. He would realize I was actively colluding with a federal financial investigator. His paranoia would peak. He would instantly trigger his emergency flight protocol, wipe his local servers, and vanish into international airspace before the FBI even opened our dossier. Furthermore, he would execute the fraudulent collateral loan against my parents' home purely out of spite. I stepped out from behind the heavy desk with my hands open. I kept my voice soft and steady, deploying the de-escalation techniques I used during hostile corporate interrogations in Tokyo. I told Lauren to put the phone down. I assured her that nothing inappropriate was happening between me and Dion. I stated we were working on a legal emergency involving her brother's company. Lauren sneered at me, her thumb hovering aggressively over Richard's contact name on her glowing screen. She mocked my explanation, asking why a simple, uneducated housewife would be involved in any corporate emergency. She announced her brother was a financial genius who didn't need my pathetic interference. She declared she was calling Richard right now to tell him exactly where his deceitful wife was hiding. Dion lunged forward, closing the distance in 2 massive strides. He grabbed Lauren's wrist tightly, preventing her from pressing the call button. Lauren shrieked in outrage, twisting her body and fighting against his grip. She accused him of physically assaulting her to protect his mistress. She threatened to call the police and file domestic violence charges if he did not release her immediately. The situation was spiraling entirely out of control. We could not physically restrain her without causing a massive legal disaster, but we absolutely could not let her make that phone call. Lauren ripped her arm free from Dion's grasp, her eyes blazing with triumphant malice. She pressed the call icon and raised the phone to her ear, a victorious smile spreading across her flushed face. I could faintly hear the dial tone ringing through the small speaker. The trap was unraveling, and I needed an immediate, devastating distraction to stop her from speaking to Richard. The trap was unraveling, and I needed an immediate, devastating distraction to stop her from speaking to Richard. Before I could move, Dion executed a maneuver of absolute terrifying authority. He did not grab Lauren again. He did not yell. Instead, he turned to the massive wooden desk, grabbed a thick stack of printed financial ledgers we had just finished compiling, and slammed them down onto the glass coffee table with a force that shattered the silence of the basement. The heavy crack of paper and cardboard hitting glass made Lauren flinch. She lowered the phone from her ear, the dial tone still ringing faintly in the quiet room. Dion pointed a rigid finger at the scattered documents. He ordered Lauren to look at the papers. His voice was no longer that of a placating husband dealing with a drunken spouse. It was the lethal, uncompromising voice of a senior federal forensic accountant interrogating a suspect. He demanded she read the highlighted columns, the offshore routing numbers, and the forged signature pages bearing my name. Lauren scoffed, refusing to look down. She clutched her phone against her chest, claiming this was just another pathetic trick to cover up our affair. She insisted Richard was a financial genius who managed millions of dollars perfectly, and that Dion was simply jealous of her brother's massive corporate success. Dion stepped directly into her personal space, his imposing height casting a dark shadow over her. He told her Richard was not a genius. He told her Richard was a reckless, arrogant criminal who was currently orchestrating an $80 million embezzlement scheme against Takahashi Industries. He laid out the entire operation in cold clinical detail. He explained the fake invoices, the phantom supply chain vendors, the cryptocurrency laundering, and the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Lauren blinked, her drunken rage faltering for a fraction of a second. She shook her head stubbornly, insisting Dion was lying. She claimed Richard would never jeopardize his career or his freedom for a scam. Dion reached onto the desk and picked up his tablet. He unlocked the screen and pulled up the high-resolution photographs I had taken of Richard's physical black ledgers from the hidden safe. He shoved the glowing screen right in front of Lauren's face. He forced her to look at her brother's unmistakable, meticulous handwriting. He forced her to read the exact payouts, the bribes, and the flight confirmation numbers for a one-way trip to Tokyo, scheduled for next month with his mistress. Lauren stared at the screen. The color rapidly drained from her flushed cheeks. She recognized her brother's handwriting instantly. The undeniable proof of his infidelity and his massive financial crimes stared back at her in high definition. She stammered, her voice losing its aggressive edge, whispering that it had to be a mistake or a corporate setup. Dion did not give her a single inch to breathe. He pressed the attack with ruthless precision. He explained the darkest part of Richard's plan. He pointed at me, standing silently by the server rack, and told Lauren exactly how her beloved brother planned to frame his innocent wife. He detailed the forged signatures, the stolen social security number, and the planted evidence Richard had prepared to ensure I spent 40 years in a federal penitentiary while he lived in luxury overseas. Lauren looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of Richard's plan was too massive to deny. She knew her brother was arrogant, but she had never comprehended the depth of his malice. Dion delivered the final crushing blow. He stepped back and crossed his arms over his chest. He issued a cold, absolute ultimatum. He told Lauren that the digital dossier sitting on his encrypted server was going directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation tomorrow morning. He stated that Richard was going to be arrested, indicted, and sentenced to decades in federal prison, and absolutely nothing could stop that chain of events. High gave Lauren a choice. She could hit the call button on her phone right now and warn Richard. But if she made that call, she would instantly become an active accessory to international wire fraud, corporate espionage, and money laundering. Dion promised her that if she tipped Richard off, the FBI would arrest her too. He swore he would personally file for an immediate divorce, take full custody of their children, and leave her to face the federal prosecutors completely alone. She would lose her pristine suburban life, her country club status, her husband, her children, and her freedom in a single night. Or, Dion offered quietly, she could put the phone down, walk back upstairs, and pretend she saw absolutely nothing. She could stand with the truth, protect her own family, and let her criminal brother face the brutal consequences of his own arrogance. The silence in the basement was deafening. The only sound was the soft hum of the cooling fans in the server rack. Lauren stood frozen, her hand trembling violently. She looked at the phone in her grasp, the screen still illuminating the contact name for Richard. She looked at the damning financial ledgers scattered across the glass table. She looked at Dion, seeing the unbreakable righteous resolve in her husband's eyes. She knew he was not bluffing. Dion was a man of the law, and he would never compromise his integrity to protect a felon. The reality of her brother's monstrous deception completely crushed her. The golden image of her wealthy, successful sibling shattered into dust, replaced by the terrifying specter of federal agents raiding their homes. Lauren let out a ragged, choking sob. Her fingers loosened their grip on the smartphone. The device slipped from her hand and fell onto the carpeted floor with a dull thud. She covered her face with both hands, weeping uncontrollably as the immense weight of the truth collapsed on top of her. She nodded her head frantically, agreeing to stay completely silent. She promised she would not call Richard. She swore she would not interfere with the federal investigation. She begged Dion not to leave her or take their children away. I let out a long, shuddering breath, feeling the massive spike of adrenaline slowly drain from my system. The disaster had been averted by the narrowest possible margin. Dion walked over to the carpet, picked up Lauren's discarded phone, and powered it off completely. He set it down on the desk and met my gaze. There was no hesitation in his eyes, only a grim professional determination. The final obstacle had been neutralized. We turned back to the glowing monitors and hit the execute command, sealing the digital dossier and preparing it for immediate federal delivery. The countdown to Richard's absolute destruction had officially entered its final hours. The countdown to Richard's absolute destruction had officially entered its final hours. Friday morning broke over Manhattan with a sharp, brilliant clarity. The sky was a vibrant, cloudless blue, offering a stark contrast to the dark corporate execution I was about to perform. I stood on the sidewalk across from the towering glass and steel monolith of the Takahashi Industries North American headquarters. The building was a fortress of modern finance, radiating wealth, power, and impenetrable security. Deep inside that architectural marvel on the 45th floor, Richard and Yumi were preparing to finalize their massive theft. Bypassing Takahashi, security required more than just walking through the front doors. Richard had explicitly instructed the lobby guards to deny me entry under any circumstances, likely claiming I was a disgruntled spouse prone to public outbursts. He underestimated my resources. During my time as an intelligence auditor in Tokyo, I acquired top-tier clearance protocols for Takahashi corporate structures. I bypassed the main lobby, entirely navigating to the underground freight entrance. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer and carried a sleek leather portfolio, projecting the undeniable aura of a high-level executive auditor. I flashed a counterfeit biometric clearance badge at the loading dock scanner. The green light chimed and the heavy steel door slid open. I stepped into the restricted service elevator and keyed in the override code for the executive suites. On the 45th floor, the atmosphere was thick with multi-million-dollar anticipation. I stepped out of the service elevator and moved silently down the plush carpeted hallway. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the primary boardroom, the scene played out like a perfectly choreographed corporate theater. Richard stood at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. He wore his finest custom-tailored suit, exuding an aura of absolute dominance and financial mastery. He projected a series of complex, fraudulent liquidity charts onto the digital smartboard. Yumi stood dutifully by his side, handing out glossy presentation binders to the 12 senior board members seated around the table. Sitting at the absolute center of the room was Chairman Kenji Takahashi. He was an older, fiercely intimidating man with silver hair and eyes like polished obsidian. He commanded complete authority. What Richard and Yumi did not know was that at 6 o'clock this morning, Chairman Takahashi received a highly encrypted federal-grade digital dossier sent directly to his private terminal. The dossier contained every single audio recording, forged signature, and offshore routing number Dion and I had compiled. I did not knock. I placed my hand firmly on the heavy chrome handle of the boardroom door and pushed it wide open. The heavy glass door swung inward with a solid, resounding thud that echoed off the mahogany paneling. All 14 heads in the room snapped instantly toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold, letting the door click shut behind me. I stood perfectly straight, locking my eyes directly onto my husband. Richard froze mid-sentence. The laser pointer in his hand dropped slightly, the red dot trembling against the projection screen. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw slackened as his brain desperately tried to process how his subservient, clueless wife had bypassed a multi-million-dollar security grid and breached a highly classified executive meeting. The shock lasted only a fraction of a second before his narcissistic rage violently took over. Richard slammed his hands down onto the mahogany table. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice booming with aggressive manufactured authority. He shouted apologies to the board members, claiming I was his mentally unstable, estranged wife who was currently suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. He declared I was stalking him due to an impending divorce and had completely lost my grip on reality. He demanded to know how I bypassed the lobby guards. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, screaming for the building security team to send armed personnel to the 45th floor immediately to drag his crazy wife out of the building. Yumi stepped forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure indignation. She attempted to play the role of the protective corporate director. She spoke rapidly in English, demanding I leave the premises at once before they filed criminal trespassing charges against me. She looked at Chairman Takahashi, apologizing profusely for the unhinged domestic disruption and promising to have me removed by force within seconds. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or defend myself against their frantic accusations. I simply stood my ground, my posture radiating lethal, unyielding calm. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with Chairman Takahashi. I watched the elderly executive slowly raise his right hand. The gesture was completely silent, but it carried the weight of absolute corporate sovereignty. The instant the chairman raised his hand, the expansive room plunged into a suffocating, terrifying silence that felt heavier than lead. Yumi snapped her mouth shut instantly, stepping backward as if she had been violently and physically struck by an unseen force. Richard froze in place, his phone hovering uselessly near his ear, his pale face suddenly slick with a cold, panicked sweat. The chairman deliberately lowered his hand and stared directly at Richard with a chilling expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Chairman Takahashi did not look at the fraudulent charts glowing brightly on the screen. He did not look at the glossy binders Yumi had distributed to the board. He slowly turned his obsidian gaze toward me. He steepled his fingers on the table, his posture completely rigid. He spoke his first words of the entire meeting, his voice cutting through the thick tension like a serrated blade. He did not ask security to remove me. He did not ask who I was. He simply nodded his head in my direction and issued a single devastating command. He ordered Richard to sit down and close his mouth immediately. Then the chairman commanded me to step up to the wooden podium and speak. I walked past Richard, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. The sheer shock radiating from his rigid body was palpable. He sank slowly into his leather chair, forced into compliance by the chairman's absolute authority. He adjusted his silk tie, shooting me a glare of pure, concentrated venom. He was entirely convinced I was about to burst into a hysterical, sobbing apology. He thought I was going to humiliate myself on the corporate stage, destroying whatever shred of dignity I had left. I stepped behind the heavy wooden podium, resting my hands lightly on the edges. I looked out at the 12 senior executives sitting around the expansive mahogany table. I took a deep, centering breath, fully unlocking the linguistic arsenal I had kept buried for 4 years. I bowed respectfully to Chairman Takahashi, maintaining the precise angle dictated by traditional corporate etiquette. I opened my mouth and spoke in absolutely flawless, high-level formal Japanese. I thanked the chairman for his unprecedented grace and the board for their valuable time. The reaction was instantaneous. Several executives actually gasped aloud. Yumi physically jolted in her seat, her perfectly contoured face draining of all color. She realized in a fraction of a second that her greatest tactical advantage, the language barrier, had just been completely obliterated. Richard, however, simply leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. A smug, arrogant smile spread across his face. He possessed absolutely no understanding of the Japanese language. He assumed I was reciting a memorized, desperate plea for forgiveness, perhaps a pathetic attempt to save my marriage in front of his wealthy clients. I turned my attention to the digital smartboard. I smoothly informed the board in Japanese that my husband had worked tirelessly on these financial projections, but I feared the language barrier might obscure the true depth of his operational strategy. I offered to serve as a designated translator for the remainder of his presentation to ensure total transparency. Chairman Takahashi nodded once, a sharp, decisive gesture granting me total control of the room. I reached into my tailored charcoal blazer and pulled out the encrypted titanium microdrive Dion and I had finalized in the basement. I plugged it directly into the master console embedded in the podium. I bypassed Richard's presentation software with a few rapid keystrokes. The massive digital screen behind me flickered. Richard's sanitized fabricated liquidity charts vanished instantly. In their place, a high-resolution scan of the Cayman Islands offshore incorporation documents illuminated the dark boardroom. The font was massive, highlighting the fraudulent shell companies and the $80 million target figure. I spoke clearly into the podium microphone, continuing entirely in Japanese. I presented Richard's shadow portfolio. I walked the executives through the phantom supply chain vendors Yumi had authorized from the inside. I displayed the cryptocurrency laundering routes and the forged signature pages bearing my stolen identity. I pointed out the forensic stamps Dion had applied to the files, verifying their absolute authenticity as federal-grade evidence. The temperature in the room plummeted. The executives leaned forward, their eyes locked onto the screen, dissecting the undeniable forensic evidence of massive corporate theft. I pressed a button on the console, switching to the next slide. High-resolution photographs of Richard's physical black ledgers filled the screen, displaying his unmistakable handwriting, detailing every single bribe, kickback, and illegal wire transfer. Richard watched the screen change, his smug smile faltering slightly. He recognized his own handwriting. He recognized the black ledgers he thought were securely locked inside his biometric safe at home. Confusion finally began to crack his arrogant facade, but his monumental ego still prevented him from grasping the catastrophic reality of the situation. He looked at Yumi, gesturing sharply with his chin, silently demanding she intervene and fix whatever technical glitch was happening. Yumi did not move. She sat paralyzed, her hands trembling violently against the edge of the mahogany table. She knew exactly what was happening. She was watching her entire life, her freedom, and her corporate career burn to the ground in high definition. I did not give them a single second to breathe. I tapped the final command into the console. The room's state-of-the-art surround sound system crackled to life. I played the digital audio recording I had captured under the door of the VIP lounge at the charity gala. The crystal-clear audio filled the expansive boardroom. Yumi's panicked voice echoed through the speakers, demanding they accelerate the timeline. Richard's voice followed immediately, booming with cruel sociopathic confidence in fluent Japanese. The recording played Richard detailing the exact date of the $80 million wire transfer. It played him confirming the offshore routing numbers. Then the most damning segment echoed through the room. Richard's voice coldly outlined his master plan to frame me. He bragged about purchasing the secondary laptop with untraceable cash, fabricating the digital invoices, and planting the security tokens in my car's spare tire compartment. He laughed on the recording, a dark, vicious sound, boasting about how the federal authorities would arrest his naive wife while he and Yumi escaped to Tokyo. I stood silently at the podium, letting his own recorded voice serve as the ultimate inescapable executioner. I looked at Richard. He was still sitting in his leather chair. He heard his own voice playing through the speakers, speaking a language he did not understand. He looked around the room, expecting to see the board members nodding in impressed agreement at whatever strategy he thought I was presenting. Instead, he saw 12 of the most powerful financial executives in the world, glaring at him with pure, unadulterated, lethal intent. Their faces were twisted in absolute rage and disgust. Chairman Takahashi looked as if he was ready to order a physical execution right there in the boardroom. The smug, victorious smile on Richard's face finally completely dissolved. His eyes darted frantically from the blazing digital screen, showing his secret ledgers to the horrifyingly clear audio of his mistress, and finally to the utterly enraged faces of the billionaires he was trying to rob. The terrifying, undeniable truth violently shattered his reality. He realized he was not the predator. He was the prey, and the trap had just snapped shut around his throat. Chairman Takahashi did not utter a single word to my husband. He shifted his gaze to the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom and gave a sharp, decisive nod to his lead security director. The director pressed a discreet button on his earpiece. Less than 2 seconds later, the massive double doors violently burst open. The heavy wood slammed against the mahogany walls with an explosive crack that made the glass water pitchers rattle. A tactical unit of federal agents flooded into the room. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision, wearing dark windbreakers, with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across their backs. They swept into the boardroom like a perfectly orchestrated storm, bypassing the stunned executives and making a direct lethal line straight for the head of the table. Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock, but his reaction was entirely useless. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather chair tipping over and crashing onto the floor. Before he could formulate a coherent sentence, two heavily armored federal agents grabbed his arms. They spun him around with brutal, uncompromising force, slamming his chest hard against the polished mahogany table. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent boardroom. Yumi did not fare any better. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek as a female federal agent grabbed her shoulder. Yumi tried to pull away, her designer heels slipping on the polished floor, but the agent swiftly pinned her arms behind her back. The elegant, untouchable corporate director was shoved face first against the glass surface of the smartboard, her cheek pressing against the projected image of her own forged offshore bank accounts. The cold steel cuffs snapped shut around her wrists, locking her in place alongside her partner in crime. The sheer chaos of the federal takedown contrasted sharply with the absolute dead silence of the Takahashi board members. The billionaires sat completely frozen in their high-backed chairs, watching the brutal execution of justice play out right in front of them. I remained standing behind the wooden podium, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the edges of the console. I watched my husband squirm against the polished wood of the conference table. Richard twisted his head, gasping for air. His face was a chaotic mask of terror, confusion, and raw, unrestrained panic. His narcissistic brain frantically searched for a way out of the inescapable corner he had painted himself into. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes finally locking onto me standing at the podium. His panic instantly morphed into a desperate feral rage. He began screaming at the top of his lungs. He shouted at the arresting agents that they were making a colossal mistake. He violently jerked his shoulders, demanding they release him immediately. He pointed a restrained, trembling finger directly at my face and screamed that I was the actual criminal. He bellowed that I was a rogue intelligence operative who had hacked his personal devices and framed him for corporate espionage. He claimed the shell companies were my creation, citing the forged signature pages I displayed on the screen as proof of guilt. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with graying temples and a sharp gaze, stepped forward. He ignored Richard's frantic shouting completely. He walked past the struggling executives and approached the podium where I stood. I did not break eye contact with my husband. I reached into my tailored charcoal blazer and pulled out a thick sealed manila envelope. I handed it directly to the lead agent. I kept my voice calm, projecting absolute unwavering authority across the chaotic boardroom. I informed the agent that the envelope contained the original physical copies of the forensic audit conducted by a senior federal compliance officer. I stated that the documents included highly detailed metadata proving the exact internet protocol addresses Richard used to forge my digital signature. I explained that the envelope also contained the physical glass lifting tape I used to bypass his biometric safe, providing a direct physical link to the hidden black ledgers currently sitting in his home office. I respectfully directed the agent to the specific pages containing the federal certification stamps, which completely exonerated me and authenticated the evidence as a priority, one corporate theft submission. The lead agent broke the seal, scanning the top pages with quick, professional efficiency. He noted the federal compliance stamps and gave me a sharp, respectful nod. He turned back to the conference table, looking down at Richard with an expression of pure, unfiltered pity. He pulled out a piece of paper from his own jacket and began reading Richard his rights in a loud, booming voice that completely drowned out my husband's pathetic protests. The reality of his inescapable doom finally crashed down on Richard. He stopped struggling against the agents. His entire body went completely limp, sagging against the edge of the mahogany table. The arrogant, untouchable financial genius was entirely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified criminal staring down the barrel of a multi-decade prison sentence. Then the final inevitable fracture of their toxic alliance occurred. Yumi, seeing the undeniable federal evidence handed over by my own hands, realized that Richard's ship was rapidly sinking straight to the bottom of the ocean. She knew he had zero leverage, zero capital, and absolutely zero chance of beating the indictment. Her self-preservation instincts violently kicked in. Yumi twisted her neck, glaring at Richard with pure venomous hatred. She began screaming frantically in English, ensuring every single federal agent and board member in the room understood her completely. She shouted that Richard was a manipulative, abusive monster. She claimed he had blackmailed her into providing the internal Takahashi security codes. She shrieked that he was the sole architect of the entire $80 million embezzlement scheme. He forced her into immediate compliance. The federal agents did not care about their sudden betrayal of one another. They simply hauled Richard and Yumi out of the boardroom, their screams echoing down the pristine corporate hallway. Chairman Takahashi personally thanked me, shaking my hand with profound respect before his security team escorted me to a private exit. I walked out onto the bustling Manhattan streets, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The media caught wind of the spectacular corporate raid by nightfall. Major financial news networks broadcasted footage of my husband being shoved into the back of an armored federal transport vehicle, his bespoke velvet tuxedo completely ruined. 72 hours later, I stood inside the bleak, sterile visitor processing area of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the luxurious penthouses and high-end sushi restaurants Richard used to frequent. The air smelled of industrial bleach and stale sweat. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with an irritating, relentless frequency. I wore a sharp, tailored beige trench coat over a simple black dress, projecting absolute composure. I cleared the metal detectors and followed a stern correctional officer down a long, windowless concrete corridor. He unlocked a heavy steel door, gesturing for me to enter the private attorney visitation room. The room was incredibly small, featuring nothing but a cold metal table bolted directly to the linoleum floor and two rigid steel chairs. I sat down and placed a single unmarked manila folder on the table. 5 minutes later, the door on the opposite side of the room buzzed loudly. 2 guards escorted Richard inside. The sight of him was genuinely staggering. The arrogant, untouchable financial executive had been completely erased. He wore a baggy, faded orange institutional jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair was a greasy, unkempt mess. Dark, heavy bags hung under his bloodshot eyes. A rough stubble coated his jawline. He looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. The guards removed his handcuffs and stepped outside, leaving us alone in the soundproof room. Richard slumped into the metal chair across from me. His hands trembled violently as he placed them on the table. He stared at me, his eyes darting frantically, searching my face for any trace of the submissive, naive wife he used to control. He found absolutely nothing but cold, impenetrable ice. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He asked me in a raspy, broken whisper why I came. He assumed I was there to offer some kind of legal settlement, perhaps a plea deal coordinated with the federal prosecutors, to avoid a highly publicized trial that would drag my name through the mud. I did not say a single word. I simply slid the thick manila folder across the cold metal table. It came to a stop right in front of his trembling hands. Richard stared at the folder for a long moment, terrified of what it contained. Slowly, he opened the cover. The top document was a formalized petition for an absolute, uncontested divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and egregious financial fraud. But the document resting directly beneath the divorce petition was the true executioner's blade. It was a certified, legally binding copy of the irrevocable trust agreement. It was the exact same document he had eagerly signed on our kitchen island, believing it was a fraudulent power of attorney targeting my parents. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal paragraphs. I watched his brain slowly process the complex financial terminology. I watched the horrifying realization violently crash over him. The document explicitly stated that every single domestic bank account, every stock portfolio, Every retirement fund and every piece of physical real estate tied to his social security number was legally transferred into a blind trust under my sole administrative control. Richard gasped, his hands gripping the edges of the paper so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He looked up at me, his face twisted in absolute terror. He realized he was completely destitute. He realized the frozen assets were not the result of a temporary banking error or a federal hold. They were frozen because he had willingly signed them away. He had zero liquid capital. He had zero leverage. He frantically stammered that he needed those funds to hire a private defense attorney. He told me the federal prosecutors were pushing for a maximum security sentence of 30 years due to the severity of the corporate espionage charges. He cried that without a top-tier legal team, he would be assigned a severely overworked public defender who would easily lose the case. He begged me to release a fraction of his money, just enough to secure a retainer for a decent lawyer. I leaned back in my steel chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I informed him that the trust was entirely irrevocable. The assets were locked indefinitely. I told him he would have to face the federal justice system with absolutely nothing, exactly like the innocent people he planned to destroy with his embezzlement scheme. The last shred of his sanity snapped. Richard shoved the metal chair backward, the screeching sound echoing loudly in the small room. He dropped heavily onto his knees right on the filthy linoleum floor. The sight of the arrogant, narcissistic manipulator kneeling before me was the ultimate validation of my strategy. Tears streamed down his rough, unshaven cheeks. He clasped his hands together in front of his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. He begged for mercy. He invoked our wedding vows, crying that we were supposed to be a team. He pleaded that we were family, and that family does not destroy each other. He swore he was brainwashed by his mistress, and that he never truly intended to hurt me or frame me. He promised he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me if I just gave him a chance to fight the federal indictment. I stood up from my chair. I looked down at the pathetic weeping shell of the man who had plotted to ruin my life while eating expensive sushi. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was low, sharp, and flawlessly precise. "I am a human being. You are a human being," I said, reciting his toxic, arrogant words back to him with lethal execution. "I shouldn't have to explain how the world works to you. Figure it out and step aside." Richard let out a devastated guttural wail, burying his face in his hands as he collapsed completely onto the floor. I turned my back to him, gathered my trench coat, and knocked firmly on the heavy steel door. The guard opened it immediately. I walked out of the visitation room, my heels clicking sharply down the long concrete corridor. I walked out of the federal detention center and stepped back into the bright, unyielding sunlight of the city. I did not look back a single time. The heavy steel doors of the Metropolitan Correctional Center sealed shut behind me, burying the ghost of my marriage in a tomb of cold concrete and iron. The fallout from the Takahashi Industries raid swept through the global financial sector like a Category 5 hurricane. The sheer scale of the embezzlement scheme sent massive shockwaves from Wall Street all the way to the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Federal prosecutors showed Richard no mercy. The trial was a highly publicized, absolute bloodbath. Richard stood in the courtroom stripped of his bespoke velvet tuxedos, an arrogant swagger, forced to wear a standard-issue beige prison uniform. His overpriced defense attorneys, funded by high-interest loans, his desperate parents took out, were completely annihilated by the mountain of forensic evidence Dion and I had compiled. The audio recording of his confession played in open court. Hearing his own voice casually plotting to frame me for an $80 million corporate theft erased any shadow of a doubt in the jury box. The judge stared down at him with undisguised contempt and sentenced him to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There would be no early parole. There would be no appeals. Yumi suffered an equally brutal fate. The Japanese authorities extradited her immediately after her initial arraignment in New York. She faced a relentless international fraud tribunal. Takahashi Industries deployed their most ruthless corporate lawyers to ensure she was stripped of every single asset she owned. She was sentenced to 15 years in a high-security Tokyo prison, her flawless executive facade permanently traded for a drab prison cell. 6 weeks after the sentencing, I received a secure encrypted message directly from the executive office of Chairman Kenji Takahashi. He requested my presence at a private lunch at an exclusive members-only club overlooking Central Park. I arrived wearing a sharp navy suit, radiating the quiet, lethal confidence of a woman who had just checkmated an international syndicate. Chairman Takahashi did not offer me empty pleasantries. He respected my intellect far too much for that. He poured me a cup of premium green tea mirroring our very first encounter. But this time the power dynamic was entirely different. He spoke in deep measured Japanese, expressing his profound admiration for my tactical brilliance and flawless risk management skills. He admitted that his own internal security apparatus had completely failed to detect the massive breach. He recognized that I had single-handedly saved his conglomerate from a catastrophic financial hemorrhage. He did not offer me a simple job. He offered me an empire. Chairman Takahashi slid a heavy leather-bound contract across the table. It was a highly lucrative executive partnership. He wanted me to take over as the managing director of strategic risk for the entire North American market. He handed me total operational autonomy, a massive budget, and an equity stake that instantly propelled my net worth into the stratosphere. I read the contract, carefully negotiated 2 additional clauses securing my absolute independence, and signed my name on the dotted line. I knew I could not build this new empire alone. Power requires absolute loyalty, and the only person who had proven his integrity in the crossfire was Dion. I drafted my first executive mandate before I even stepped into my new corner office. I reached out to my brother-in-law and offered him the position of Chief Compliance Officer for the entire Western Hemisphere division of Takahashi Industries. I doubled his federal salary and gave him a dedicated team of elite forensic accountants. Dion accepted the offer immediately. We transformed from a desperate underground alliance into an impenetrable corporate vanguard. We spent our days restructuring the entire security architecture of the firm. We implemented biometric safeguards and algorithmic monitoring systems that would flag even a single dollar moving out of place. We became an untouchable force on Wall Street. While my professional life skyrocketed to unprecedented heights, the remnants of Richard's family completely disintegrated under the heavy weight of their own toxic delusions. Lauren finally woke up from her lifelong submission to her family's narcissistic narrative. The undeniable reality of her brother's crimes and the devastating proof of his sociopathic cruelty shattered the golden pedestal she had placed him on. She realized her parents were not victims, but active enablers who had cultivated Richard's monstrous ego from childhood. Even after the federal conviction, even after the audio recordings were broadcast on national television, Richard's parents adamantly refused to believe he was a criminal. They launched a pathetic public smear campaign against me. They told their country club friends I was a manipulative intelligence operative who had framed their brilliant, innocent son. They blamed Dion for betraying the family and aggressively accused Lauren of abandoning her own blood. They mortgaged their sprawling Connecticut estate to pay for Richard's useless legal fees, blindly draining their retirement accounts to chase a lost cause. Lauren drew a hard, permanent line in the sand. She chose her loyal husband, her children, and the undeniable truth over her family's collective insanity. She officially severed all contact with her parents. She blocked their numbers, returned their frantic letters unopened, and legally barred them from visiting their grandchildren. She sold the modern farmhouse near her parents and bought a beautiful, highly secure home closer to the city, physically and emotionally removing her family from the toxic radiation of her past. She started attending intensive therapy to unlearn the abusive dynamics she grew up with, slowly rebuilding her life on a solid foundation of reality rather than manufactured prestige. Lauren's newfound peace was the final satisfying closure to the collateral damage Richard had caused. She had successfully extracted herself from the poisonous web her parents had spun for decades, proving that bloodlines do not dictate loyalty or morality. As for me, my transformation was entirely complete. I stood in my expansive new corner office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering an unobstructed, breathtaking panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. The afternoon sun cast a brilliant, golden glow over the concrete and steel canyons of the city, illuminating the empire I now commanded. The pristine glass desk behind me held multi-million-dollar risk assessment portfolios, all requiring my final executive signature. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable housewife arranging throw pillows and brewing artisan coffee in a suburban kitchen. I was the managing director of strategic risk for one of the most powerful corporate conglomerates on the planet. I pressed my palm flat against the cool, thick glass of the window, looking down at the bustling streets far below. A profound, unbreakable sense of calm washed over my entire body. I thought back to that rainy Tuesday evening at the exclusive sushi restaurant. I remembered the exact moment Richard and Yumi began speaking in fluent Japanese, utterly convinced of their absolute superiority. I remembered the sickening, sharp pain of betrayal slicing through my chest, swiftly replaced by the cold, calculating instinct of a trained corporate intelligence auditor. Richard had looked at me with such profound contempt. He had weaponized his arrogance, trying to shrink me down into a submissive, compliant pawn. He truly believed he could steal my identity, drain my finances, and leave me to rot in a federal prison while he lived out his luxurious fantasies overseas. He had looked me right in the eye and delivered his toxic, defining manifesto. I am a human being, you are a human being. I shouldn't have to explain how the world works to you. Figure it out and step aside. I smiled at the reflection of my sharp-tailored navy suit in the window glass. I did figure it out. I figured out his passwords, his biometric safe, his offshore routing numbers, and his meticulously planned flight paths. I mapped out his entire criminal syndicate while he slept soundly in the bed next to me. I did not step aside. I stepped directly in front of the moving train and derailed it completely. His arrogance was his most fatal vulnerability. I was so addicted to the sound of his own voice, so obsessed with his own perceived genius, that he completely failed to recognize the lethal predator sitting right across the kitchen island. My journey over the past few months had crystallized into a series of undeniable harsh truths. A marriage certificate is not a shield against betrayal, and shared history does not excuse abuse. Society conditions women to believe that maintaining the peace is our primary duty, even when the foundations of our lives are built on deceit. We are taught to cry, to confront our abusers emotionally, and to beg for closure that toxic individuals will never grant us. I refuse to play that pathetic game. I realize that your silence is never a sign of weakness. It is a tactical advantage. Every time I kept my mouth shut while Yumi insulted my home decor, every time I nodded politely, while Richard handed me fraudulent legal documents I was gathering ammunition.